Welcome back everyone to part 5 of our interaction system series. So far we've implemented a basic interaction system with a widget that pops up to explain how to interact with the item. But we only have one way to interact, which is press to interact. In this part we will add a hold to interact, which is more impactful than it sounds, because to implement this we'll be using everything we've built so far. The interface, the actor component, the widget, and we'll be adding enums and event dispatchers, so you're going to learn a lot in this tutorial, and I'm very excited to start. So let's do it. Alright, so the first thing we need to do to have different types of interactions like press and hold is to define these types. For example, let me just go to any blueprint here, and I can have a variable. For example, we can call it type. This could be an integer, right? So meaning a whole number. So I can say 0 is type hold, 1 is type press, and so on. Or it can be a string or a name where I can just type in the name here. Oh, this is hold or this is press. But this is not an ideal way of doing it because then you can misspell it, or maybe one time you put a P small, one time you put P capital, it's not going to work. And of course, if it's a number, you have to remember that 0 is press and 1 is hold. So using these types of primitive variables is not a good idea. So instead, what we'll be doing is using enums. For this, you can use both enums or gameplay tags. What enums and gameplay tags are, they're a way to define text like hold and press, but in a semantic way that can be used as variables later on. So let me show you the example with enum. So I'm going to go in my interaction system folder here. I'm going to right click and search for enumeration. That's what enum means. And I'm going to call it e_interaction type. And if we open it up, the enum asks you to add enumerators. So we're going to have two. The first one is press. That's the name of this type, or hold. So we have two types, press and hold. And now that we define an enum, we can use these text variables later on as hard-coded values so that we don't have to worry about misspelling them. For example, if I create a new variable here of type interaction type, this enum we just created, now I can pull off, and now when I'm setting this variable, it's going to ask me, do you want it to be press, do you want it to be hold, and so on. And if I get this variable, I can then check, oh, is it equal to... is it enum equal to press, then do something? Is it equal to hold, then do something? So using enums, we avoid the issue of not knowing which one is press and which one is hold that we had with the integer, and we avoid the issue of misspelling it that we had with using a string or a name. So we're going to go with this approach. So let me delete this variable because it was just a test. And now let's see how we're going to use our enum. So the way we're going to use it is, we want our interactable objects to tell us. Like maybe the door will tell me that this is a hold to interact, while the pickup will tell me it's a press to interact. So we need the interactable actor itself to define which type it is. And to do that, we're going to add an interface function in our BPI interactable interface. So if you recall, this is the interface that all interactables implement. And we only have an interact function now inside this interface. So we're going to add a new function, and we're going to call it getInteractionType. So this is a function where each interactable actor will define, and we can call it to understand which type this actor has. And to do that, we're going to add one output to this function. So this function returns one thing, which is the type or the interaction type. And this is going to be of type interaction type, the enum, the interaction type enum we created. So this means that for any interactable actor, they have to define, are they press to interact, are they hold to interact, and when we want to figure out this information, we just call this function. So let's see how it's implemented. So if I go to my, where is it, interactables, let's go to the door, for example. And under the interfaces, we should see the new function pop up here, getInteractionType. And if I double click it, then I implement it. And I can say, okay, well, the door is going to be press, so I'm going to keep it at that. And I'm going to open the pickup item. And I'm going to say, okay, the pickup item is going to be, so I did the same thing, open the interfaces tab, double click get interaction type. And I'm going to change this one to hold. So that means that anytime I call getInteractionType, so if I have a reference to my pickup item and I call getInteractionType, it will give me hold, but if I call it on the door, it will give me press. So this is how each interactable will define their own interaction type. One thing to note, just a side note here, is that these are values that are hard-coded. This means that all doors are press and all pickup items are hold. If you want them to be some doors are press and some are hold, you can change this to a variable. What do I mean? So the pickup item here, I can right-click on this and say promote to variable, and I'm going to call it the interaction type. So now this function returns this variable, and this variable, I'm going to make it instance editable and expose on spawn. The reason I'm doing this is now, if I go to my level, I have two items here, two pickup items, and we see the interaction type variable here that's set to hold. So I'm going to change this one to press. So now I changed it only for this shield. If I click on the sword is now hold, the shield is now press. So we can define different types for each interactable, even if they're the same class, by adding this as a variable. I'm going to keep it like this for now. I don't think I'm going to be using it, but yeah, just so that we have it for reference. The door, we're just going to hard code it as press, where the pickup item, we're going to keep the variable that can be defined by the instance itself. All right, now that we have the interactables defining their type, we need to use this type. So in our player interaction component, this is when we start interacting with things. So if you recall, we have the interact function, and when it starts, we check if there's something in range, and then we immediately start the interact sequence. So we play the animation and start interacting right away. We want to change this because if it's hold, you don't interact right away. You have to keep holding the input for some time before interacting. And if it's press, then you interact right away, and you can have different types in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move everything here into a separate custom event. And let's call this so add a custom event, and let's call this the interact with active interactable. So this is the function that we call when we actually want to start the interaction, but we start it at different times depending on if it's press or hold. So here, when the input is started, we want to check, is it press, then interact right away. If it's hold, then do something else. And instead of doing it all right here, I'm going to add also another function or custom event and call it interact begin. Because we can have interact begin, interact ongoing, if the hold is pressed, interact end, if it's ending before the triggers, before it's triggered, and so on. So this is the function that we're just going to call when we start pressing the interact button. So we're just going to call interact begin right here. All right, so what is this interact begin going to look like? Let me just make some room here. So the interact begin, first thing we want to do is get our active interactable. So we have a function that does that. If you recall here, get active interactable. So I'm going to call this function, but I want to make sure that it is valid first. So I'm going to do an is valid check, just in case there is no active interactable. Just like we're doing here, we're first checking if there's an interactable in range before playing. Actually, we should also replace this with the same check. It's better than checking for something in range. It's better to check if there is something active, because maybe there's something in range, but it's not active. So actually, this is a better check. So if there is a valid interactable in range, then continue. All right, and here we do the same thing. So before we begin interacting, we check that we have an active interactable. And if it is valid, then we want to get its interaction type. So we can just pull off of this and say get interaction type. And this is the interface function we created earlier. And it should give me a type. And this type, I'm going to do a switch on it. So I'm going to call switch. Switch is just the same as doing a branch and checking for if press do this, if hold do that, but it just gives me a shorthand for it. So on press, if the interaction type of the active interactable is press, this is very easy. We just call the function that does the interaction. So this one that we just created, which is interact with active interactable. So basically, we're just saying if it's press, then play the montage and interact right away. You don't need to do anything else. But what if it's hold? What do we need to do then? And here's when things get interesting. So on hold, what we want to do is check how long the input has been held for. And if it's held for longer than X amount of seconds, then call the active interactable. So how do we know how long the button has been pressed? Well, luckily, the enhanced input action, which is this one, the IA interact, gives us the elapsed time in seconds. So this is how long the input has been pressed, and it gives us an event ongoing that keeps firing as long as the input keeps pressed. So, for example, I'm going to print something here, and I can print how many seconds have passed. This won't work right away. Let me show you. So if I do this, I'm now pressing the E key, which is the interact button, but nothing is printing. This is because ongoing isn't always called on any type of input. It's only called on specific types of input. So we need to modify our enhanced input itself. All right, so I believe we added this inside third person inputs and actions, and we have IA interact. So right now, this IA interact doesn't have any triggers or modifiers, so it's just the default behavior. Now we need to modify, or we need to add a trigger. So when does this input actually trigger? So if I do a plus here on the triggers, I can see all the different trigger types. So you might be tempted to use hold because this is what we want to check. But there is a problem here. If we use hold, hold basically gives us the exact functionality we want. So the input won't trigger until the hold time threshold has been defined. So we can say, okay, you have to hold the input for 2 seconds before it's triggered. And when it is triggered, we go back here, then this execution pin is called. But the problem here is that this time, this 2 seconds or this 3 seconds is static. We can't modify it dynamically. But for our system, we want it to be very flexible. So maybe the door needs to be held for 1 second, but the pickup item needs to be held for 2 seconds and so on. So to be able to modify the number here, the hold duration, we're not going to use hold. So what other options do we have? Well, we have released. And if you read the message on release, it says trigger returns ongoing whilst the input exceeds the actuation threshold. So if the actuation threshold is just if you have a button like a trigger button on a controller, 0.5 means it's pressed halfway in. But for a keyboard, the actuation is 0 or 1, so it doesn't have a variable rate. So this just means that if the button is pressed, the ongoing event will be triggered. And this is what we want, because we want to check ongoing and how much time has passed. So just by doing this little change, changing it to released or adding a trigger released, now if we play, I'm going to press the E key, and now you see the print. And as soon as I release the E key, it stops printing and the ongoing event stops firing. And when I press it again, it starts counting from the beginning. So this is how we're going to tell how long the key has been pressed. So now that we have a way of figuring out how long the key has been pressed, what do we do with this information? You might be tempted to do a check here. So check if the interaction type is hold and the elapsed seconds is more than 1 second, then call the interact function. So you might be tempted to do this all here, but we already have a place, the interact begin, where we check for the interaction type. And if it's press, we do something. And now if it's hold, we want to do something here. We don't want to duplicate all this information up here as well. Otherwise, we have 2 places that are checking the same thing. So how do we get the elapsed seconds from here to here? Well, to do that, we're going to be using event dispatchers, and probably in a way you haven't seen before. So pay close attention to this part. And if you don't know what event dispatchers are, they are a way to trigger an event somewhere in your code and then listen to this event and react to it somewhere else in your code. If you want to learn more about event dispatchers, I have a full video describing them in detail, which I recommend you check out if you don't know what they are. All right, so what I'm going to do is create a new event dispatcher and call it on interaction press ongoing. And this event dispatcher is going to have 1 variable. So I'm going to click on the plus here. And this variable is going to be the elapsed seconds. And it's going to be float. So now we have an event that we can call. So if I can pull it here and just say call. On the ongoing press, I'm calling this event and passing in the elapsed seconds. So what I'm saying here is that whenever the interact button is pressed, regardless of whether there's an interactable nearby or regardless of whether the interactable is hold or press, just in any case, I want you to dispatch this event to tell me that how much time has passed in seconds while this input is being pressed. But I want to listen to this event, or I'm interested in this event only in the case when the interaction type is hold. So here I'm going to bind to this event. Binding again means that I'm interested in what's happening, so notify me when this event occurs. So to do that, I'm just going to say bind to on interaction, so the name of our event dispatcher. So when I say bind, that means that I'm only interested in being notified when this event occurs here during this part of execution. At any other point in time, this can still be firing, but don't notify me unless this is called. So now that I have this bind, that means I want to do something at this point of execution when this event is being dispatched. And the something I want to do is defined here in this event. So I'm going to pull off and say custom event. And I'm going to call it on interaction ongoing. So here is what I want to do when the interaction type is hold and the active interactable is valid. So when we reach this part of the execution and the event is dispatched, here I want to check now, do a branch, and check if the elapsed time in seconds, let me just again make some room here. If the elapsed time in seconds is greater than, let's just do a static number of 1 here. So if it's greater than 1, then I want to call the interact with active interactable, which is the function that proceeds with playing the montage and doing the interact. All right, now one very important thing you have to do at the end. So if the time exceeds the threshold we define, we interact, but then one very important thing we have to do is we need to call unbind from ongoing. So call the unbind event from on interaction press ongoing. This is the name of our event dispatcher. So here we bind to it, and when we're done, so we waited the second and we interacted, we need to unbind, and we pass in the event that we're unbinding from, which is this one. So this means that don't call this function again when this event is dispatched, because I have now unbinded from it. And the reason we do this is because once you bind to something, this will keep triggering every time this one is called, regardless of this execution happening again or not. Meaning that if you don't unbind and you press the input again, this will still be called without doing all the checks before it. So we unbind to say we are no longer interested in listening to this event until you reach this part of the execution for a second time, and then we bind again. So this is very important to do. So let's do a quick recap because this part can be a bit confusing. What we do here is we press the interact button, and when the interact button is held down, we dispatch an event called on interaction press ongoing, and we pass a variable of how long the input has been held for until now. And then when we call the interact begin, we call it whenever the input is pressed for the first time. We check, is there an active interactable in range? If so, get its interaction type. If it's press, then just proceed to interact right away. But if it's hold, then listen or bind to this on interaction press ongoing event. And every time that it is called, and it's again called on tick here because ongoing is called on tick. Every time it's called, then run this custom event that will check how long the elapsed seconds is. And if it's greater than 1 second, then call the interact function and then unbind. So stop listening to this event from now on. There's just one thing I forgot to mention, which is unbinding in another scenario. So right now we only unbind once the condition for how long we should be pressing the button is met. But what if I stop pressing the button before the condition is met? So we press the button just for 0.5 seconds, we dispatch the event, we bind to it, but then we never complete the 1 second. So this is never happening. We never unbind, and then there's still something bound to an event that we no longer are interested in. So what we need to do is on, canceled, and completed in either of them. We need to unbind from all events. So choose unbind events, all events from on interaction press ongoing. This means anyone that's listening to this event, tell them to stop listening now because we either completed or canceled the input. So this is also really important. Otherwise, you'll be listening to an event in the wrong time. So we do all of these unbinds to ensure that we are only getting notified when we want to, and we are not getting notified when we don't want to. So again, super important to pay attention to these things. All right, and that's basically the execution flow for handling both a press and a hold. So let's test it out. If you recall, the shield is press, the sword is hold, and the door is, yeah, we define it as always press. So let's test it out. I'm going to go here, press just once, and it opens. So shield should be press once, and we interact. All right, now sword, I'm pressing, and I'm letting go, and nothing is happening because it's a hold. But now if I hold it for 1 second, there we go. Now it works. All right, so I was planning on doing the updates to the interaction widget to support the new hold interaction type in this part as well, but it's already pretty long, so I'm going to leave it for the next video, but I'm going to release it pretty soon. You won't have to wait long for this one. But I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you did, please consider giving a like and subscribe. And if you want to download the full project files, they're all available to download on my Patreon. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.